A woman smirks in a courtroom after trying to kill a police officer, convinced she's untouchable. But when the judge opens his mouth, her confidence shatters. Instead of a prison cell, she's sentenced to something far worse: house arrest under the very officer she tried to destroy. Forced to face him every day, she lashes out, fights back, and spirals deeper. But when her smirk makes national headlines and the world turns against her, she's left with a terrifying question. Has she just ruined her life forever? Or is this the moment that will finally change everything? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The evening air hung heavy with late summer heat as Maggie Wells gunned her silver sedan down the empty street. Her jaw clenched tight, matching the death grip she had on the steering wheel. The radio hummed softly, some pop song about love and happiness that felt like a cruel joke right now. Sweat trickled down the back of her neck, making her shirt collar stick uncomfortably to her skin. "Just shut up," she muttered, jabbing the power button. The silence felt better, more honest. It matched the darkness creeping into her thoughts. Her phone buzzed again on the passenger seat, dancing across the leather surface. Another text from Rick, probably. Her ex never knew when to quit. Work had been bad enough, her boss writing her about deadlines, co-workers whispering behind her back like she couldn't hear every word. She didn't need Rick's special brand of criticism on top of everything else. The memory of his last voicemail made her stomach twist. The red light ahead burned bright against the darkening sky, a warning she chose to ignore. Maggie's foot hovered over the brake for a split second before pressing down harder on the gas instead. Her lips curved into a bitter smile as she blew through the intersection, her heart racing with a mix of defiance and reckless abandon. The flash of headlights in her mirror was her first warning, cutting through the growing dusk like a knife. Then came the explosion of red and blue, the sharp wail of a siren cutting through her angry haze. A police cruiser pulled out from its hiding spot, engine roaring to life in pursuit. "You've got to be kidding me," Maggie spat, her hands tightening on the wheel until her knuckles went white. The leather creaked under her grip. The cruiser gained ground quickly, its presence growing larger in her rearview mirror. Officer Trent Lawson sat straight-backed behind the wheel, his dark eyes focused intently on her car. His voice crackled over the loudspeaker, firm and authoritative. "Pull over to the right." Something snapped inside Maggie. Years of swallowing other people's judgment, of being told what to do, of trying to meet impossible expectations. It all came boiling up at once. She stomped on the accelerator, feeling the engine surge beneath her. "Not tonight," she growled, swerving across 2 lanes without signaling. A horn blared as another car barely avoided her, the driver's shocked face visible for a split second in her peripheral vision. The police cruiser kept pace, lights painting everything in harsh flashes of red and blue that reflected off nearby buildings and windows. "Pull over now," Lawson's voice commanded again, stern but controlled, like a parent dealing with a defiant child. Maggie's heart hammered against her ribs as reality started seeping in through the cracks of her anger. The speedometer needle climbed past 80, then 90, the engine whining in protest. Her hands were shaking now, cold sweat breaking out on her forehead as street signs and trees blurred past. The screech of tires filled her ears as Lawson's cruiser drew closer, hemming her in. The flashing lights seemed to fill her whole world now, and a new emotion started to replace the anger. Fear. Raw and primal, it clawed at her chest. "Oh God," she whispered, the full weight of what she'd just done crashing down on her. "Oh God, what am I doing?" Her voice trembled, barely audible over the roar of the engine and her own thundering pulse. The fluorescent lights of the gas station cast harsh shadows across the empty parking lot as Maggie's car rolled to a stop, the engine ticking as it cooled. Her hands trembled slightly as she shifted into park, adrenaline still coursing through her veins like electricity. The cruiser's lights painted everything in alternating flashes of red and blue, transforming the mundane scene into something almost surreal. Officer Lawson emerged from his vehicle with measured steps. his movements precise and controlled like a man who'd done this 1,000 times before. His hand rested near his holster, not threatening, but ready. The sight made Maggie's throat tighten, though she tried to swallow down the rising anxiety. "License and registration," he said, his voice steady and professional, clipboard already in hand. Maggie felt a familiar surge of defiance rise in her chest, hot and comforting in its familiarity. She crossed her arms, tilting her chin up with practiced rebellion. "Why? Because I scared you?" Lawson's expression didn't change, his face as immovable as stone. "License and registration," he repeated, each word carrying more weight than before, like heavy drops before a storm. Maggie let out a harsh laugh, slumping back against her seat. "Fine. Arrest me." The words came out like a dare, though her heart hammered against her ribs. At Lawson's signal, Carter moved forward with practiced efficiency. They opened her car door, the hinges creaking in protest against the quiet night air. "Step out of the vehicle," Lawson commanded, his voice carrying the full weight of authority. When they reached for her arms, Maggie jerked away, her body acting on instinct. "This is ridiculous." Her voice echoed across the empty parking lot, bouncing off the concrete walls of the gas station. "Resisting will only make this worse," Lawson warned, his tone leaving no room for argument, years of experience evident in every word. The fight drained from Maggie's shoulders, replaced by a cold resignation that settled deep in her bones. She allowed them to secure the handcuffs around her wrists, maintaining her smirk even as the metal clicked into place with finality. They guided her to the police cruiser, her shoes scraping against the rough pavement like sandpaper. The back door opened with a heavy thunk, and she ducked inside, the reality of her situation beginning to sink in. As the door slammed shut behind her, the artificial confidence began to crack like thin ice. The interior of the cruiser surrounded her with its distinct smell of stale coffee and worn leather, a scent she'd never noticed before, but would never forget. The handcuffs bit into her skin, cold and unyielding, a constant reminder of her predicament. Sitting there, separated from the officers by a metal grate, Maggie felt the first real flutter of uncertainty in her stomach, like a trapped butterfly. Maybe this wasn't something she could just brush off with attitude and excuses. Maybe this time, her actions would have real consequences. The holding room's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Maggie shifted uncomfortably in her beige jumpsuit. The fabric felt rough against her skin, like sandpaper scraping with every movement, and her wrists still carried the ghost of handcuffs. She glanced at the clock on the wall for the 100th time, each tick making her more irritated, each minute dragging like an hour. "Wells, Maggie," a court officer called out, his voice echoing in the sparse room. She stood up, rolling her shoulders back and lifting her chin. The nervousness churning in her stomach? She buried it beneath a layer of practiced indifference, the same way she'd buried everything else that threatened to make her feel vulnerable. The courtroom doors opened with a heavy creak that seemed to announce her arrival. Maggie strode in like she owned the place, her footsteps echoing against the polished floor, each step deliberate and defiant. Her eyes immediately found Officer Lawson standing near the prosecution table, his uniform crisp and perfect, not a badge or button out of place. His face remained as unreadable as the night he arrested her, though she caught the slight narrowing of his eyes. Judge Raymond Whitaker sat behind his imposing bench, his silver hair and lined face speaking to decades of experience. Deep creases marked the corners of his mouth as he studied her file with narrowed eyes, his mouth pressed into a thin line of disapproval that seemed carved into his features. Linda Morrison, the prosecutor, stood up, her navy suit as sharp as her tone. "Your Honor, the defendant showed complete disregard for public safety. Her actions weren't just reckless. They were dangerous and could have resulted in tragedy. We're fortunate no one was hurt." Thomas Gray, Maggie's court-appointed attorney, jumped to his feet, his tie slightly askew. "My client acknowledges this was a serious lapse in judgment, Your Honor. She has no prior record of..." A lapse in judgment, Morrison cut in, her voice rising with indignation. She led an officer on a high-speed chase through city streets, through residential neighborhoods. Maggie settled back in her chair, examining her nails as if this were all beneath her attention. The chipped purple polish suddenly seemed fascinating. She could feel the tension in the room building like a thunderstorm, but she refused to let it touch her, wrapping herself in a cloak of carefully crafted disdain. Judge Whitaker's voice cut through the argument like steel. "Ms. Wells." He leaned forward, his eyes boring into her like laser beams. "Do you even understand the gravity of what you did?" Maggie shrugged, her lips curling into a smirk that she'd perfected over years of confrontation. The courtroom erupted in disapproving whispers, a wave of judgment that rolled over her without leaving a mark. She noticed Officer Lawson's reaction from the corner of her eye. Just a slight tightening of his jaw, nothing more. His rigid self-control only made her want to push harder, to crack that perfect facade he wore like armor. The judge released a heavy sigh, his patience visibly wearing thin as he drummed his fingers once on the bench. "We'll see if you're still smiling after I'm done." Maggie leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms across her chest like a shield. She'd been in tough spots before, had weathered worse storms than this. She could handle whatever this old man threw at her. But something in the way Judge Whitaker stared her down sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. Tiny, almost imperceptible, but there all the same. For just a moment, her certainty wavered. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Judge Whitaker settled back into his chair, his stern expression betraying no emotion. Maggie's fingers drummed against the wooden table, her earlier bravado starting to waver under the weight of the judge's unwavering gaze. The silence in the courtroom was palpable, thick with anticipation. "All rise," the bailiff called out, and Maggie stood, her legs slightly unsteady, though she attempted to conceal her nervousness. Judge Whitaker's steely eyes locked onto Maggie, his voice carrying through the hushed chamber. "Ms. Wells, I've reviewed your case thoroughly. Your actions that night were not just reckless. They were a deliberate choice to endanger the lives of others." Maggie rolled her eyes, but something in the judge's tone made her stomach tighten with unease. "You seem to think this is all a game," the judge continued, leaning forward. "Your attitude in this courtroom today proves you haven't learned anything. You're reckless, entitled, and a danger to society." The smirk that had been playing on Maggie's lips began to fade as the weight of the judge's words sank in. However, Judge Whitaker paused, shuffling some papers on his desk. "I don't believe prison time will teach you the lesson you need to learn." Maggie's shoulders relaxed slightly, a small laugh of relief escaping her lips, until the judge raised his hand. "Instead, I'm sentencing you to 6 months of house arrest, under the direct daily supervision of Officer Trent Lawson, whose life you so carelessly put at risk during your little stunt." The courtroom erupted in surprised murmurs, and Maggie's mouth fell open in disbelief. "You can't be serious," she blurted out, earning a sharp look from her lawyer. Officer Lawson stood perfectly still near the prosecution table, his expression unchanged, except for the slight tightening of his fingers against his belt, betraying the tension he felt. "I am entirely serious, Ms. Wells," Judge Whitaker replied coldly. "Officer Lawson will monitor your compliance with all conditions of your house arrest. You will follow his instructions to the letter." The bailiff approached with an ankle monitor, its black surface gleaming under the harsh lights. Maggie watched in horror as he knelt down and secured it around her ankle, the click of the lock echoing in her ears like the slamming of a jail cell door. Her lawyer wouldn't meet her eyes, and Officer Lawson's face remained impassive. And there, in the middle of the courtroom, Maggie's carefully constructed wall of defiance finally began to crack. She looked down at the monitor now firmly attached to her ankle, then back up at Officer Lawson. Their eyes met across the courtroom, and for the first time since this whole ordeal began, Maggie felt truly trapped, her sense of control slipping away. Sunlight crept through Maggie's bedroom window, but she'd barely slept. Her head throbbed as she blinked away the fog of exhaustion, each pulse a reminder of her restless night tossing and turning. When she moved to get up, something caught her ankle. For a moment, she forgot. Then reality hit her like a punch to the gut, knocking the air from her lungs. The black plastic ankle monitor stared back at her. Ugly. Heavy. A constant reminder of yesterday's disaster in court. Judge Whitaker's stern face flashed through her mind, making her stomach turn. "This isn't happening," she muttered, running her fingers over the device. It felt alien against her skin, like some kind of high-tech parasite that had latched onto her during the night. The smooth plastic surface mocked her attempts to find a comfortable position. Maggie stood up slowly, testing her movement. The monitor's weight threw off her balance, making her feel clumsy and off-kilter. She shuffled to her bedroom door, then down the hallway, wincing at the unfamiliar sensation. Each step made the device rub against her ankle, already threatening to leave a mark. In the kitchen, her phone lit up with its harsh blue glow. A text from Gray. "This isn't a joke. One misstep, and Whitaker will revoke the deal. Do not test the limits." The words made her chest tight with frustration. "Whatever," she growled, tossing the phone onto her counter with more force than necessary. Her eyes landed on the liquor cabinet, its glass doors reflecting the morning light. A bottle of vodka sat there, promising temporary escape from this nightmare. She grabbed it, fingers wrapping around the cool glass. Just one drink to take the edge off. Maybe then she could think straight, find a way to deal with this mess. Her phone buzzed again, the sound sharp and accusatory. Another message from Gray. "You'll be breathalyzed at random. One positive test and you're done." "You've got to be kidding me." Maggie slammed the bottle back into the cabinet so hard it rattled the others. The sound echoed through her empty house like a gunshot, emphasizing her solitude. She gripped the edge of the counter, knuckles turning white under the strain. Everything was being controlled. Where she could go, what she could drink, who she had to answer to. Her freedom had vanished overnight, replaced by rules and restrictions that made her feel like a caged animal. A sharp knock at the door made her jump, her heart skipping a beat. 3 firm raps that seemed to mock her situation, each one precise and demanding attention. Maggie's jaw clenched until her teeth ached. She didn't need to check who it was. Officer Lawson, right on time to start his babysitting duty, probably wearing that stern, uncompromising expression she remembered from court. She stared at the door, her heart pounding with a mixture of anger and something else. Maybe fear, though she'd never admit it, not even to herself. The knock came again, more insistent this time, reminding her that her new reality wouldn't simply go away if she ignored it. Maggie yanked the door open, her lips curled in a sneer. Officer Lawson stood like a statue on her doorstep, clipboard tucked under one arm, his badge catching the morning light. His crisp uniform and steady gaze made her feel even more disheveled in her wrinkled t-shirt and sweatpants, like a teenager caught breaking curfew. Without a word, he stepped past her into the house, bringing with him the faint scent of starched cotton and coffee. His eyes moved methodically across the living room, taking in the pile of unwashed dishes, scattered magazines, and empty takeout containers. Each sweep of his gaze felt like an indictment. Daily reports, mandatory therapy, no alcohol, no visitors. His voice was as flat and cold as a frozen pond, each syllable precise and measured. Each word felt like another bar in an invisible cage, slowly boxing her in. Maggie crossed her arms and leaned against the kitchen counter, forcing her lips into a mocking smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "What if I don't?" Lawson's expression didn't change. He might as well have been carved from stone, his jaw set in that familiar, uncompromising line. "Then you'll be in a real cell." The threat hung in the air between them, heavy and undeniable. Lawson placed a small black device on the counter, a breathalyzer, its plastic surface gleaming under the kitchen lights. "We do this every morning. Blow." Maggie let out a harsh laugh, but something in his unwavering stare made her stomach twist into knots. She snatched up the device, making a show of rolling her eyes as she followed his instructions, her hands trembling slightly despite her defiant attitude. The machine beeped, showing she was clean. Lawson gave a single nod, like he was checking off a box in his mind, his movements mechanical and practiced. Therapy starts at 2. Be ready. She watched him walk toward the door, his back straight, steps measured, shoes clicking against the floor. Everything about him screamed control and authority. 2 things she'd spent her life fighting against, 2 things that now held her future in their grip. As soon as he left, Maggie's fingers closed around the breathalyzer. Her arm tensed, ready to send it flying into the wall, her muscles coiled with familiar rage. But something stopped her. The cold reality of her situation seeped in like water under a door, impossible to ignore. She hated this, hated him. But there was no escape route this time, no way to charm or argue her way out of the corner she'd painted herself into. The sterile, impersonal office felt like a cold, confining cage to Maggie as she sank into the creaking leather chair, the squeaking sound grating on her nerves. The room's clinical aroma of vanilla air freshener only heightened the sense of judgment that permeated the space. Across the mahogany desk sat Dr. Evelyn Carter, her dark eyes sharp and penetrating, exuding an air of unwavering composure. Dressed in a deep purple blazer with her silver-streaked hair pulled back in a neat bun, the psychologist's meticulously put-together appearance stood in stark contrast to Maggie's own frayed emotional state. "Let's talk about why you're here," Dr. Carter said, her voice calm but firm, brooking no room for evasion. Maggie let out a derisive snort, crossing her arms defensively as she slumped further into the chair. "Because some cop got his feelings hurt," she retorted, the bitter sarcasm in her tone barely concealing her underlying discomfort. Dr. Carter's expression remained unchanged, her hands folded with practiced poise on the desk. "That's an interesting deflection," she observed, her measured words cutting straight to the heart of Maggie's resistance. The word deflection made Maggie's skin crawl, and she shifted in her seat, the leather creaking again as she struggled to maintain her composure. "This is a joke," she snapped, her voice sharper than she had intended. Leaning forward slightly, Dr. Carter's unwavering gaze remained fixed on Maggie's face. "You're not angry at the system. You're angry at yourself," she stated matter-of-factly, the words landing like a physical blow. Maggie's chest tightened, and an uncomfortable chill settled in the pit of her stomach, leaving her momentarily breathless. Nobody had ever cut through her defenses so quickly, so precisely, exposing the raw truth she had worked so hard to conceal. Abruptly, Maggie shot to her feet, the chair scraping against the floor as she did so. "We're done," she declared, her voice shaking slightly with a mixture of anger and vulnerability. Dr. Carter made no attempt to stop her as Maggie stormed toward the door, the sound of pens scratching against paper echoing in her wake. Maggie didn't need to look back to know that she had just lost the first round in this battle of wills. A battle that would test the limits of her defenses and challenge her to confront the painful truths she had long sought to avoid. Maggie sprawled dejectedly on her worn leather couch, the TV remote clicking rhythmically as she aimlessly flipped through the channels. None of the programs, not the cooking shows, the reality TV dramas, or even her favorite crime series, could hold her attention. The constant reminder of the ankle monitor weighed heavily on her with each passing hour. Click, click, click. Suddenly, her finger froze on the button as her own face filled the screen. Her stomach lurched with dread. The now infamous courtroom smirk. Maggie Wells, convicted of attempted assault on a police officer. The male anchor's voice dripped with disapproval, the footage replaying the scene in vivid detail. There she was, sitting in the courtroom, that arrogant smirk plastered across her face. She hardly recognized herself, seeming so cruel and callous. Judge Whitaker's stern face then appeared on the screen, his words cutting through the silence of her living room. Public outrage continues over the light sentence given to Wells. The anchor continued, his perfectly styled appearance and pressed suit making Maggie feel even smaller and more insignificant. Maggie's hands balled into tight fists, her knuckles turning white against her thighs. The world had already judged and condemned her, deciding who she was and what she had become. Desperate for understanding, she grabbed her phone from the coffee table, needing someone, anyone, to talk to. Nathan would surely understand, she thought. "Hey, it's me," she typed with trembling fingers. "Can we talk?" 1 minute passed. 2. 5. No response. She hit the call button, her heart pounding with each unanswered ring. "Hey, this is Nathan. Leave a message." "Damn it!" She slammed the phone down onto the cushion beside her, the silence in the apartment pressing in and suffocating her. She snatched up the phone again, typing frantically, "Nathan, please. I need you." Still, nothing. With a scream of frustration, she hurled the phone across the room. It hit the wall with a crack and clattered to the floor. Maggie sat there breathing hard, staring at the fallen phone. The TV anchor's voice droned on, but she barely heard it now. The truth hit her like a physical blow. She was completely, utterly alone. Maggie's phone buzzed incessantly, jolting her awake. Notifications flooded her screen. Missed calls, texts, social media alerts. Her heart raced as she unlocked the phone, her stomach already knotting with dread at what she might find. The first message hit her like a slap. "Rot in hell, you racist monster." The words seemed to pulse on the screen, each letter burning into her vision. Her fingers trembled as she scrolled, unable to stop herself from reading more. Each message was worse than the last, a cascade of hatred pouring through her screen. "Your life is over. Bah! Hope you can't sleep at night. People like you deserve worse." The words blurred together as her breathing quickened, becoming shallow and rapid. Sweat beaded on her forehead and trickled down her temples. She threw the phone across the room like it was on fire, watching it bounce off the wall and clatter to the floor, a small part of her hoping it would shatter completely. This couldn't be happening. Not to her. Not like this. She needed someone to talk to. Anyone who might understand. Her legs felt wobbly as she retrieved her phone, ignoring the spider web of cracks now stretching across its screen, and dialed Sarah, her best friend since college. Straight to voicemail, the cheerful greeting felt like mockery. Mike from work? No answer. Just endless ringing that echoed in her ears. Even her cousin Jenny, who'd always been there for her through every crisis and celebration, let it ring until voicemail picked up. The silence was deafening, pressing in from all sides. Maggie's hands shook as she stumbled to the kitchen cabinet, her movements jerky and desperate. The whiskey bottle gleamed in the morning light, promising sweet relief from the nightmare her life had become. She unscrewed the cap with trembling fingers, the familiar smell tempting her with memories of easier times. Just one sip, to take the edge off. That's what she told herself, the same lie she'd believed too many times before. The bottle hovered near her lips, the glass cool against her skin. A sharp knock at the door made her jump, the sound like a gunshot in the quiet apartment. The bottle clinked against the counter as she set it down, the sound accusatory in the stillness. Maggie yanked the door open, fury rising in her chest like a tide of molten lead. Officer Lawson stood there in his crisp uniform, clipboard in hand, looking as immovable as a statue. His expression didn't change as he took in her disheveled appearance. The messy hair, the dark circles under her eyes like bruises, the wrinkled clothes she'd slept in that reeked of yesterday's mistakes. "You look like hell," he said flatly, his voice devoid of either judgment or sympathy. Maggie's shoulders sagged. The fight drained out of her like water from a broken vessel. For once, she couldn't muster a snappy comeback or a defiant glare. She just stood there, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on her, crushing what little strength she had left. Maggie sat at her kitchen table, the morning light casting harsh shadows across the scratched wood surface. The ankle monitor felt like a lead weight, its green light blinking steadily, a constant reminder of her new reality. She drummed her fingers against the table, unable to sit still despite her bone-deep exhaustion. Her phone lay face down nearby. She couldn't bear to look at it anymore, couldn't stomach another message telling her what a monster she was. The knock came right on schedule, 3 sharp raps that made her jaw clench. She yanked the door open, not bothering to hide her irritation. Officer Lawson stood there, clipboard tucked under his arm, expression neutral as always. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his polished shoes clicking against the linoleum floor. His eyes swept across the kitchen, taking in the unwashed dishes and empty takeout containers. "Therapy today?" His voice was flat, professional. Maggie let out a harsh laugh. "Are you my babysitter or my parole officer?" Lawson didn't even blink at her tone. He just kept writing on his clipboard, each scratch of his pen making her anger spike higher. "Neither," he said finally, looking up. "Just the guy keeping you out of prison." She crossed her arms tight across her chest, trying to hold on to her anger like a shield. "Why do you care?" For the first time, Lawson's eyes met hers directly. There was something in them that made her want to look away. Something too sharp, too knowing. "I don't waste energy on people who hate themselves." The words hit her like a physical blow. She clenched her fists, nails digging into her palms, but couldn't find any words to throw back at him. She watched him walk toward the door, his steps measured and confident. As he left, she felt stripped bare, like he'd peeled back all her layers of anger and defiance and seen straight through to something she didn't want to acknowledge. The therapy office felt different this time. Maybe it was the afternoon light filtering through the blinds, casting warm stripes across the carpet. Or maybe it was Maggie herself, sitting up straight instead of sprawled defiantly across the chair. Dr. Carter's eyes held the same steady patience they always did. Her notepad lay untouched on her desk. She wasn't writing today, just watching, waiting. "How has the week been?" Dr. Carter asked, her voice gentle but firm. Maggie shrugged, but it wasn't the dismissive gesture from before. "Hard," she admitted, surprising herself with the honesty. Dr. Carter nodded, letting the word hang in the air between them. The clock ticked softly on the wall. A car horn honked somewhere outside. "Tell me why you're angry," Dr. Carter said finally, leaning forward in her chair. Maggie let out a short laugh, but it sounded hollow even to her own ears. She opened her mouth to fire back one of her usual sarcastic responses, but something stopped her. The words died in her throat. Her hands twisted in her lap. The silence stretched on, but Dr. Carter didn't rush her. She just waited, calm and steady as always. Maggie's jaw tightened. She could feel something building in her chest, something she'd kept locked away for so long. When she finally spoke, her voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "Because no one ever gave a damn." The words hung there, raw and honest. Dr. Carter nodded slowly, as if she'd known this truth all along, and had just been waiting for Maggie to find it. "And what if they did?" Dr. Carter asked quietly. "What then?" Maggie's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time in their sessions, she had no quick comeback, no defensive retort. She just sat there, feeling exposed and uncertain. As she stood to leave, her legs felt shaky. The familiar weight of anger was still there, but something else had cracked open inside her, something that made her want to come back tomorrow, to sit in this chair again, to keep talking. She paused at the door, hand on the knob, but didn't look back. She didn't need to. They both knew something had shifted today. Maggie had almost forgotten what peace felt like. The morning sun warmed her face through the living room window as she sat on her worn leather couch, actually breathing easily for the first time in weeks. Her ankle monitor felt lighter somehow, less like a shackle and more like, well, she wasn't ready to call it a wake-up call. But something had shifted after yesterday's therapy session. Her phone chirped. She almost let it sit there, not wanting to break this fragile moment of calm. But curiosity got the better of her. The notification showed an unknown number with a video link below. Her thumb hovered over the screen. Something in her gut told her not to click, but she did anyway. The video loaded, and her stomach dropped. There she was, in that beige jumpsuit, wearing that stupid smirk she now wished she could erase. The caption beneath the video made her blood run cold. White privilege on full display. Maggie's hands trembled as she scrolled through the comments. Each one felt like a punch to the gut. Lock her up and throw away the key. This is what's wrong with America right there. She thinks she's untouchable. Disgusting. I hope she loses everything. Then she saw it. The original poster's username. Her heart stopped. Nathan J_1979. Nathan. Her ex. The man who'd promised to always have her back. Who knew all her secrets, all her struggles. The betrayal hit her like a physical blow. She could picture him, sitting at his computer, carefully editing the video for maximum impact, knowing exactly how much damage it would do. Her fingers shook as she pulled up his contact. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3. Then the automated voice. The number you have reached is not accepting calls at this time. Rage and hurt boiled over. With a scream of frustration, Maggie hurled her phone at the wall. It hit with a satisfying crack, pieces of the case scattering across the floor. She stood there, chest heaving, staring at the broken phone. All that progress, that tiny moment of peace, gone. Just like that, she was back to being the villain in everyone else's story. Maggie's hands trembled as she stared at her shattered phone on the floor, the screen a spider web of cracks. Dark circles hung under her eyes from a sleepless night spent tossing and turning. Every time she drifted off, that smirk, her own smirk, haunted her dreams. She dragged herself to the couch and grabbed the remote, hoping for a distraction. Bad move. The news anchor's polished voice filled the room. Maggie Wells, now infamous for her smirk in court, continues to be a symbol of privilege and reckless behavior. Her stomach lurched. She gripped the armrest so hard her knuckles turned white, fighting the urge to throw the remote through the screen. The leather creaked under her grip as she watched footage of herself, that cursed moment playing over and over. The buzz of her phone made her jump. Unknown number. Her heart pounded as she picked it up, throat dry as sandpaper. "Who is this?" Her voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. The silence on the other end stretched for what felt like forever. Then, a low chuckle that made her skin crawl. "Guess you're finally getting what you deserve." Click. The dial tone hummed in her ear like a wasp. Maggie's hands went cold and clammy. She lowered the phone slowly, her whole body shaking now. The morning sun that had warmed her living room just moments ago felt harsh and exposing. She sank deeper into the couch, staring at nothing. The TV droned on, but she couldn't hear it anymore over the rushing in her ears. For the first time since this whole nightmare began, she felt genuinely scared. Maggie paced her living room like a caged animal, each step making the ankle monitor feel heavier. The walls seemed to close in with every turn. Her breath came in short gasps as she ran her fingers through her unwashed hair. "I can't do this," she whispered to herself. "I can't take it anymore." Her eyes landed on the liquor cabinet. Inside, a bottle of vodka beckoned, promising escape, promising relief. With shaking hands, she grabbed it and unscrewed the cap. The sharp smell of alcohol hit her nose as she lifted the bottle to her lips. Then she froze. Lawson's voice echoed in her head. "One positive test and you're done." The bottle trembled in her grip before she slammed it down on the counter, sending a hollow bang through the empty house. Her chest heaved as panic clawed at her throat. That's when she saw it, the drawer where she kept her kitchen knives. Something clicked in her mind. Maggie yanked the drawer open and grabbed a sharp knife. Her hands were steady now as she knelt on the floor, examining the ankle monitor's strap. The plastic was thick, but not impossible to cut through. She began sawing at it, careful not to nick her skin. Sweat beaded on her forehead as she worked. Minutes passed, marked only by the sound of the knife grinding against the strap. Finally, with a soft snap, the monitor fell away. Maggie stared at it lying there on the floor, her heart pounding in her ears. She stood up slowly, testing the feeling of her bare ankle. No weight, no restrictions. Without thinking twice, she walked to the front door and stepped outside. The night air hit her skin like a kiss of freedom. Stars twinkled overhead, and a cool breeze rustled through the trees. She took deep breaths, savoring every second of liberty. 5 minutes, that's all she got. Then came the sirens. The night air felt electric against Maggie's skin as she stood on her front lawn. Stars twinkled above, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of jasmine from her neighbor's garden. For one glorious moment, she felt free, truly free. Then came the sound that made her blood run cold. A siren's wail pierced the quiet neighborhood, followed by the harsh flash of red and blue lights that painted her white house in alternating colors. Her legs turned to lead. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe, as Officer Lawson's cruiser pulled up to the curb. The headlights caught her like a deer in their glare. Lawson stepped out slowly, deliberately. His uniform was crisp, his movements controlled, but Maggie saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. "What the hell is wrong with you?" His voice was quiet, but it carried more weight than if he'd shouted. Maggie forced herself to stand straight, crossing her arms across her chest. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her voice steady. "It's just fresh air, officer." The look he gave her could have frozen hell. Without a word, he strode to the passenger side of his cruiser and yanked the door open. The hinges creaked in protest. "Get in!" Maggie's throat went dry. She'd seen Lawson annoyed, frustrated, even stern, but this was different. This was fury wrapped in a thin layer of professional restraint. She hesitated, shifting her weight from foot to foot. The cut ankle monitor lay discarded in her kitchen, like evidence of a crime she couldn't take back. Lawson took 3 steps toward her, each one deliberate. His eyes burned into hers, dark and unforgiving. "Now." Maggie felt her defiance crumble. Her shoulders slumped as reality crashed down around her. With gritted teeth, she walked to the cruiser and climbed in. The door slammed behind her with a finality that made her flinch. Through the windshield, she watched Lawson walk around to the driver's side. His movements were stiff, controlled, like a man doing everything in his power not to explode. As he slid into the driver's seat, Maggie realized with crystal clarity that she wasn't in control anymore. Lawson was. The interior of Lawson's police cruiser felt smaller than any cell. The dashboard lights cast a soft blue glow across their faces as they drove through the empty streets. Maggie kept her arms crossed tight against her chest, stealing glances at Lawson's stern profile. She waited for the lecture, the angry words, the threats. But nothing came. Only the steady hum of the engine filled the space between them. Maggie's leg bounced with nervous energy. The silence pressed in on her like a physical weight until she couldn't take it anymore. "Are you gonna say something or just sit there?" Her voice came out sharper than she intended. Lawson let out a long breath, his fingers flexing on the steering wheel. "I don't even know where to start." "It's not that serious," she scoffed, though the words felt hollow even to her own ears. "You think this is a game?" The edge in his voice made her spine stiffen. "I think you love feeling important." She tried to sound dismissive, but her heart was pounding. Lawson turned to face her then, and something in his eyes made her shrink back against the seat. His voice was quiet, but cut through her like a blade. "You think this is about me? My father was killed by a reckless driver when I was 10. A man just like you. Someone who thought rules didn't apply to him." The words hit Maggie like a physical blow. Her stomach twisted into knots. This wasn't what she expected. This wasn't part of their usual dance of defiance and authority. Lawson shook his head, his jaw tight. "You almost killed someone, and you still act like it's nothing. I don't know if you're ignorant or just too scared to face yourself." For once in her life, Maggie Wells had nothing to say. No quick comeback, no defensive retort. The truth of his words left her raw and exposed. The cruiser pulled up to her house, the headlights illuminating her front door. Lawson didn't turn to look at her as he spoke. "Fix yourself, or don't, but stop wasting my time." He stepped out of the car and slammed the door, leaving Maggie alone with the weight of his words. Maggie's fingers traced the edge of the ankle monitor, feeling every ridge and groove. The morning sun streamed through her kitchen window, but she barely noticed it. Her mind kept replaying Lawson's words from last night, over and over like a broken record. "My father was killed by a reckless driver. Someone just like you." The words stung differently now, in the harsh light of day. She picked up her phone, thumb hovering over the screen before scrolling through the flood of hateful messages. Each one felt like a punch to the gut. "Monster." "Entitled witch." "Hope you rot." Her chest tightened as she read them. For the first time, she didn't feel the familiar surge of defensive anger. Instead, a different question bubbled up. Were they right about her? The kitchen suddenly felt too small. Her breathing quickened as she glanced at the windows, knowing she couldn't step outside. The walls seemed to close in. Her hands trembled as she pulled up her contact list, scrolling until she found Dr. Carter's office number. She stared at it for a long moment, her thumb hovering over the green call button. Pride told her to put the phone down. Ego screamed at her to tough it out alone. But something else, something quieter and more honest, made her press call. The phone rang 3 times before a friendly voice answered. "Dr. Carter's office. How can I help you?" Maggie's throat felt dry. She opened her mouth, closed it, then forced herself to speak. I need an appointment. Today." Her voice sounded small, even to her own ears. Not defiant, not angry. Just tired, and maybe a little scared. The receptionist's keyboard clicked in the background. "Dr. Carter has an opening at 2 p.m. Would that work for you?" Maggie gripped the phone tighter, her knuckles turning white. "Yes," she whispered. "That works." After confirming the details, Maggie hung up. Her heart raced, but not from anger this time. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she'd made a choice that wasn't about running away. Maggie shifted in the leather chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The familiar scent of coffee and old books filled Dr. Carter's office, but something felt different today. The weight of last night's conversation with Lawson pressed down on her shoulders. Dr. Carter studied her with those piercing eyes that seemed to see right through every defense. The silence stretched between them, but this time, Maggie didn't try to fill it with sarcasm or anger. "Why are you here today?" Dr. Carter's voice was gentle but firm. Maggie's throat felt dry. The words she'd rehearsed in her head on the drive over suddenly seemed inadequate. She took a shaky breath. "Because I don't want to be this person anymore." Dr. Carter nodded slowly, her expression unchanging. "Then let's start with the truth. Why did you run that red light?" The question hit Maggie like a physical blow. Her first instinct was to deflect, to make excuses. But she was tired, so tired of running. "I was angry," she whispered. "At what?" "At everything." The words felt hollow, even as she said them. Dr. Carter leaned forward slightly, her eyes never leaving Maggie's face. "Number B specific." Maggie's hands clenched into fists, her heart hammered against her ribs. The truth was right there, burning in her throat. She'd never said it out loud before, never even let herself think it fully. "At myself." The words hung in the air between them. Maggie felt exposed, raw, like someone had peeled back her skin and left her nerve endings bare to the world. She sat there, stunned by her own admission, the weight of it pressing down on her chest. Dr. Carter remained silent, letting the moment settle. The ticking of the clock on the wall seemed impossibly loud in the quiet room. Maggie had said it out loud, and now she had to deal with it. Maggie sank deeper into her worn couch, her body heavy with emotional exhaustion. The therapy session had left her drained, vulnerable in a way she wasn't used to. The living room felt too quiet, the shadows growing longer as evening settled in. Her phone vibrated against the coffee table, making her jump. She stared at it, her heart rate picking up. Unknown number. Her finger hovered over the screen before she finally answered. "Hello?" A low chuckle crackled through the speaker. "Still think you're getting away with it?" Click. The line went dead. Maggie's hands trembled as she lowered the phone, her throat tight. She could feel sweat breaking out on her palms, her breathing becoming shallow. Almost against her will, her fingers moved to open social media. There it was, still trending. Her face, that damned smirk frozen in time. The comments rolled in like poison. "Nice act. No one believes you. Hope that cop never lets you breathe easy. Die." Her stomach lurched. She scrolled faster, each message worse than the last. People she'd never met dissecting her character, declaring her beyond redemption, hoping for her downfall. The words blurred together, but their venom remained sharp. The video played again automatically, her courtroom performance on endless loop. That confident smirk now looked like a stranger's face. Was that really her? That arrogant woman who thought she was untouchable? Her chest felt tight. The therapy session's breakthrough seemed distant now, fragile in the face of this relentless hatred. She'd finally admitted her faults, finally wanted to change. But the world had already made up its mind about her. Maggie dropped the phone like it burned her, pressing her fingers hard against her temples. A headache pulsed behind her eyes. Even if she changed, would anyone care? The question echoed in her mind, heavy with doubt and fear. The harsh studio lights beat down on Maggie as she shifts uncomfortably in the sleek leather chair. Her simple blue blouse feels too tight around her neck, and she resists the urge to tug at it. The makeup artist had offered to cover her dark circles, but Maggie had refused. Let them see what this has done to her. Catherine Royce sits across from her, elegant in a crisp black suit, her silver-streaked hair perfectly styled. She shuffles her papers with practiced precision, then looks up with eyes that could cut glass. 3, 2, 1. The floor director signals, and the red recording light blinks on. "Good afternoon. I'm Catherine Royce, and today we're speaking with Maggie Wells, whose recent courtroom behavior sparked national outrage." Catherine's voice is smooth but carries an edge. "Millions have seen your courtroom smirk. Many believe you're the symbol of privilege and recklessness. Do you agree?" Maggie's throat tightens. Her rehearsed answers evaporate. She can feel the weight of every camera lens, every judgment. Her hands tremble slightly in her lap. "I don't expect forgiveness," she says, her voice barely steady. "But I refuse to pretend I was the victim." Catherine's eyebrow arches slightly. "So, you admit you were reckless?" Maggie nods, feeling the truth of it deep in her bones. "I was angry. I was selfish. I thought the world owed me something, and I acted like it did." The studio falls silent. Even the cameramen seem to hold their breath. Catherine leans forward, her expression intense. "Then tell us, why should anyone believe you've changed?" Maggie exhales slowly, the question she's been dreading, the one that matters most. "Because for the first time in my life, I'm not trying to lie my way out of it." The words hang in the air, raw and honest. Catherine studies her face, searching for any trace of deception. The cameras continue rolling, capturing every moment of vulnerable silence. The segment wraps up, but the tension remains thick in the studio air. Maggie has laid herself bare before the nation. Whether they believe her or not, she can't take it back now. Maggie's coffee grows cold as she stares at her phone, lying face down on the kitchen table. Sunlight streams through the window, casting long shadows across the worn wooden surface. Her fingers drum nervously against the table's edge, creating a rhythm that matches her racing heart. "Just do it," she whispers to herself, reaching for the phone with trembling fingers. The Twitter app opens with a soft chime. Her stomach clenches as Das Maggie Wells' interview fills her screen. The first comments hit her like punches. "Fake tears won't fix what she did. Rich white lady thinks she can cry her way out of trouble. Once entitled, always entitled." Maggie's throat tightens, but she keeps scrolling. Then something different catches her eye. Did anyone else notice? No makeup, no fancy clothes. She looked real. Maybe she's actually getting it? IDK. That didn't feel like an act. She blinks hard, reading the comments again. They aren't kind exactly, but they're different, thoughtful, questioning. A notification pops up. Unknown number. Her heart skips as she opens the text. It's a start. 3 simple words. She doesn't need to check who sent it. Only one person would be that brief, that measured. Lawson. Maggie sets the phone down, her hands still shaking slightly. The world isn't ready to forgive her. Maybe it never will be. But for the first time since this started, she feels something unfamiliar stirring in her chest. Not hope exactly, but possibility. She takes a deep breath, watching the morning light dance across her kitchen counter. The hatred is still out there. The anger hasn't gone away. But somewhere in the flood of responses, a few voices are willing to consider that maybe, just maybe, people can change. Maggie sits in the familiar courtroom, but everything feels different now. The wooden bench beneath her doesn't feel as hard, and the air doesn't crackle with tension like before. Sunlight streams through tall windows, casting gentle shadows across the nearly empty room. Judge Whitaker's glasses catch the light as he studies her case file. His stern expression hasn't changed, but there's something different in his eyes. A hint of curiosity, maybe even cautious approval. "Ms. Wells," he says, his voice firm but not unkind. "Your house arrest period ends today." He pauses, looking up from the papers. "Do you feel like you've learned anything?" Maggie meets his gaze steadily. No defiance now, just quiet certainty. "Yes." The silence stretches between them, heavy with unspoken words. Then Judge Whitaker nods, seeming satisfied with what he sees in her face. "Then I hope I don't see you in here again." The words hang in the air. Maggie glances around the quiet courtroom. No reporters jostling for position, no cameras flashing. Just her lawyer beside her, shuffling papers, and she turns toward the back of the room. Officer Lawson sits there, straight-backed and watchful. He doesn't smile or nod, doesn't make any gesture at all. He's just present, witnessing. A court officer approaches with keys for her ankle monitor. The metal feels cool against her skin as they remove it. When it finally comes off, Maggie rubs her ankle, surprised by how naked it feels. The weight is gone, but somehow she feels more exposed than ever. She stands slowly, adjusting to the strange lightness in her step. The sunlight through the windows feels warmer now, more real. She's free to walk anywhere, but the thought makes her heart flutter with an emotion she can't quite name. Her lawyer gathers his briefcase, nodding at her with professional courtesy. Judge Whitaker has already moved on to his next case, and Lawson, she glances back one more time, remains in his seat, a silent guardian of this moment. Maggie walks toward the courthouse doors, each step measured and deliberate. The heavy doors swing open, and bright sunlight floods in. She steps outside, feeling the warmth on her face. For the first time in months, there's nothing between her and the world. No monitor, no restrictions, no barriers. The bell above the coffee shop door chimes softly as Maggie steps inside. The aroma of fresh coffee fills her nose, but her shoulders remain tense. After weeks of isolation, being in public feels strange, like wearing clothes that don't quite fit anymore. A few customers type on laptops or scroll through phones. None of them look up. Maggie lets out a small breath she didn't realize she was holding. The barista smiles politely, waiting for her order. "Just a regular coffee, please," Maggie says quietly, her voice barely carrying over the gentle hum of coffee machines and quiet conversation. While waiting, she lets her eyes wander around the shop. That's when she sees him. Officer Lawson sits in the corner, his uniform replaced by casual clothes, a simple black t-shirt and jeans. He's reading something on his phone, a half-empty coffee cup on the table before him. Maggie's chest tightens. For a moment, she considers leaving, but something keeps her feet planted firmly on the floor. Maybe it's pride. Maybe it's something else. Lawson looks up, his dark eyes meeting hers. The moment stretches between them like a thread pulled taut. There's no hostility in his gaze, no judgment, just quiet recognition. Slowly, deliberately, he nods once. Maggie swallows hard. Her hand trembles slightly as she returns the gesture with a small nod of her own. No words pass between them. No words need to. The simple acknowledgement says everything necessary. "Regular coffee?" the barista calls out. Maggie turns, takes her cup with a quiet, "Thank you." The coffee is hot against her palm as she walks toward the door. She passes Lawson's table, close enough to catch the scent of his coffee, something dark and strong. Neither of them speak. Neither of them need to. The bell chimes again as she pushes the door open, stepping back into the morning sunlight. No smirk crosses her face this time. Just quiet acceptance of how far she's come and how far she still has to go. The city lights twinkle against the dark sky as Maggie settles into her weathered balcony chair. The night air feels crisp on her skin. No wine glass in her hand. No urgent need to escape. Just the quiet company of her thoughts and the distant hum of traffic below. Her phone feels heavy in her hand as she unlocks it. The screen casts a soft glow on her face as she navigates to her messages. Nathan's name sits there like an old wound, loaded with memories of betrayal and hurt. Her thumb hovers over it for a moment. The anger rises, familiar, almost comfortable. But this time she lets it wash over her without taking control. With a deep breath, she presses delete. His name disappears, taking a weight with it. She scrolls further, stopping when she sees Lawson's message. It's a start. Simple words that somehow carry more meaning than all of Nathan's elaborate excuses ever did. Her fingers move across the keyboard, forming responses. "Thank you." Delete. "I understand now." Delete. "You were right." Delete. The words don't feel necessary anymore. Some lessons are better left in silence, understood but unspoken. She sets the phone down on the small table beside her. The evening breeze rustles through her hair as she gazes back at the cityscape. Streetlights and building windows create a tapestry of light against the darkness. She doesn't need to run anymore. Doesn't need to hide. The city keeps moving, and for once, she's ready to move with it. Maggie's footsteps echo in the familiar hallway of the medical building as she approaches Dr. Carter's office. The waiting room feels different today. Not like a prison, but like a sanctuary. Her hand doesn't shake when she turns the doorknob. Dr. Carter sits in her usual spot, her dark eyes sharp and observant as always. The leather chair across from her desk no longer feels like an interrogation seat. Maggie settles into it, noticing how her body naturally relaxes instead of tensing up. "Didn't think I'd see you today," Dr. Carter says, her voice carrying a hint of pleasant surprise. Maggie shrugs, adjusting her position in the chair. "Figured I should at least finish what I started." The words come out easier than expected, without her usual defensive edge. Dr. Carter studies her face, taking in the subtle changes, the softer expression, the absence of that hard shell Maggie used to wear like armor. So, what now? Maggie exhales slowly, her hands resting loosely in her lap instead of clenched into fists. I don't know, but... She pauses, tasting the unfamiliar honesty on her tongue. I think that's okay. The afternoon sun streams through the office window, casting warm patterns on the carpet. Dr. Carter leans forward, her expression both serious and gentle. You're going to mess up. Just not in the same way. A smirk crosses Maggie's face, not the bitter, defiant one from the courtroom, but something more self-aware, almost amused. That's the idea. The session continues with a different rhythm than before. No more verbal sparring, no more walls to break down. Just two people having an honest conversation about growth and change. When Maggie finally stands to leave, the sunlight through the doorway feels welcoming rather than harsh. She steps outside, feeling the warmth on her face. For the first time, she doesn't feel like she's dragging her past behind her. She's walking towards something new. The bell above the diner door chimes as Maggie steps inside. The smell of coffee and bacon fills the air, mixing with the quiet chatter of morning customers. She clutches a wrinkled job application in her hand, her knuckles white from gripping it too hard. Finding an empty booth, she slides in and smooths the paper against the scratched Formica table. The questions are simple enough until she reaches that dreaded section. Previous convictions. Her pen hovers over the blank space. It would be so easy to leave it empty, to pretend those months never happened. But something stops her. Dr. Carter's voice echoes in her head. Change isn't about hiding from who you were. Taking a deep breath, Maggie writes it all down. The reckless driving, the attempted assault on an officer, the house arrest. Her hand shakes slightly, but she doesn't stop until every detail is there in black and white. Linda Hughes approaches, coffee pot in hand. She's got the weathered look of someone who's spent decades managing difficult customers and early mornings. Her name tag is slightly crooked, and her gray-streaked hair is pulled back in a practical bun. You the one asking about the waitress position? Linda's voice is gruff, but not unkind. Maggie nods, pushing the application across the table. Yes, ma'am. Linda sets down the coffee pot and picks up the form. Her eyes narrow as she reads, and Maggie's stomach tightens. This is usually where it ends, where people decide she's not worth the risk. This is you. Linda taps the conviction section with her finger. Maggie straightens her shoulders. No more hiding. Yeah, that's me. Linda studies her face for a long moment, then looks back at the application. The diner's sounds fade into background noise as Maggie waits for the inevitable rejection. Instead, Linda just sighs. You ever wait tables before? The question catches Maggie off guard. No, she admits, then adds quickly, but I learned fast. A hint of a smirk plays at Linda's lips. We'll see about that. She sets the application down. You start tomorrow, 6 a.m. sharp. Don't be late. Maggie blinks, not quite believing what she's hearing. Really? Everyone's got a past, Linda shrugs. What matters is what you do with your future. She picks up her coffee pot. Now, you want some coffee while you fill out the rest of that paperwork? Maggie nods, a small smile forming. Yes, please. As Linda pours the coffee, Maggie feels something she hasn't experienced in years. A real chance. Not pity, not judgment, just an opportunity to prove herself. She walks out of the diner into the bright morning sun, the weight on her shoulders just a little lighter. For once, her past isn't a wall blocking her path. It's just part of her story. The morning sun streams through the diner's windows, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor. Maggie ties her apron with practiced ease, the familiar motion now as natural as breathing. She balances a heavy tray loaded with plates of steaming eggs and crispy bacon, weaving between tables with the grace of someone who's done this 1,000 times. "Order up for table 6, Linda calls from the kitchen. Maggie delivers each plate with a genuine smile, not the fake one she used to wear like armor, but something real. The work is hard, her feet ache by day's end, but there's dignity in it. No lies, no running, just honest work. A crash breaks through the breakfast chatter. A customer at table 3 knocked over his coffee, brown liquid spreading across the table. Without hesitation, Maggie grabs a handful of napkins and rushes over. "Don't worry about it," she says, already soaking up the spill. "Happens all the time." From behind the counter, Linda watches, a small smile playing at her lips. She's seen Maggie's transformation over the past year, from defensive and guarded to someone who genuinely cares about doing things right. The door chimes as Maggie heads to the register. She looks up, ready with her usual greeting, but the words die in her throat. Officer Trent Lawson stands in the doorway, still in uniform. Their eyes meet, and for a moment, neither moves. Then Lawson walks to the counter, sliding onto a stool like any other customer. "Coffee black," he says simply. Maggie's hands move automatically, grabbing a clean mug. She can feel Linda watching, curious about this unexpected visitor. "Didn't expect to see you here," Maggie says, keeping her voice steady as she pours the coffee. Lawson shrugs, his expression unreadable. "Didn't expect to be here." The silence between them feels heavy with unspoken words. Maggie wipes down the counter, more for something to do than actual need. Finally, Lawson speaks. "You seem different." Maggie nods, meeting his gaze. "I am." She sets his coffee in front of him, and for the first time, they're just two people sharing a quiet moment in a busy diner. No ankle monitor, no court orders, no judgment, just understanding. Maggie pushes open her apartment door, the familiar creak welcoming her home. Her feet ache from a double shift at the diner, but it's a good kind of tired. She kicks off her worn sneakers, letting them land near the small shoe rack she bought at the thrift store last month. The apartment isn't much, just a studio with a kitchenette and a bathroom, but every bill is paid on time, every piece of furniture chosen with purpose. No more designer labels, no more pretending to be something she's not. The second-hand couch has a small tear in one cushion, but it's comfortable. The coffee table still wobbles slightly, but she fixed it herself. Settling onto the couch, she pulls out her phone. Her thumb hovers over the contacts list, muscle memory still trying to scroll to names that aren't there anymore. Nathan's number, deleted. The fair-weather friends who disappeared after her arrest, gone. The social media accounts that once fed her ego, deactivated. Instead, she finds Linda's name at the top of her recent contacts. "Morning shift tomorrow, 6 a.m., reads the latest message. Below that, Dr. Carter's weekly appointment reminder sits like an anchor, keeping her steady. And then there's Lawson's contact. Their last exchange remains unchanged. It's a start. She never replied, and somehow that feels right. She closes the phone, letting out a long breath. The silence of her apartment wraps around her like a comfortable blanket. No drama, no chaos, no running from herself. Maggie stretches her legs out on the couch, feeling the tension release from her muscles. The ankle monitor is long gone, but sometimes she still feels phantom weight there. Not as a reminder of restriction, but of change. She's free now, truly free. Not just from legal constraints, but from the person she used to be. The evening light filters through her single window, casting warm shadows across the floor. She doesn't need to run anymore. She's exactly where she needs to be. Maggie steps into the fluorescent-lit grocery store, the automatic doors whooshing shut behind her. She grabs a red plastic basket, its familiar weight settling against her arm. The store isn't crowded, just a few early morning shoppers pushing carts down the aisles. She walks past the produce section, her shoes squeaking against the polished floor. A year ago, she would have ordered groceries for delivery, anything to avoid being seen. Now, she takes her time, examining apples and checking tomatoes for ripeness. In the dairy aisle, Maggie reaches for a carton of milk. That's when she hears them. The whispers she's learned to recognize. That's her. The one who... The voices drift from somewhere behind her, probably near the yogurt display. Maggie's hand pauses on the milk carton. Her shoulders tense for just a moment, then straighten. She doesn't hurry, doesn't pretend she didn't hear. Instead, she turns slowly, deliberately, meeting the gaze of a middle-aged woman in a blue sweater. The woman's companion, clutching a shopping list, looks away quickly. The woman in blue shifts uncomfortably under Maggie's steady gaze. Her cheeks flush pink. "Sorry," she mutters, tugging at her sweater sleeve. Maggie gives her a single nod. No anger, no defensive words, no hurried escape down the aisle. She simply turns back to her shopping, placing the milk in her basket with careful movements. She continues down the aisle, picking up cheese and butter. Her steps are unhurried, her head held level. The whispers fade, replaced by the soft hum of the refrigeration units and distant beeping of checkout scanners. At the register, Maggie places her items on the conveyor belt one by one. She bags her own groceries, the plastic crinkling as she fills them methodically. The cashier gives her exact change, which she tucks into her wallet. With bags in hand, Maggie walks toward the exit. She doesn't glance back to see if anyone's watching. She doesn't need to. She's not running anymore. Maggie stands outside the red brick police station, her feet tracing small circles on the concrete. The summer heat beats down on her shoulders, but that's not why she's sweating. Every few seconds, she glances at the glass doors, then away again. Her reflection shows a woman different from the one who left here in handcuffs over a year ago. Hair pulled back neatly, wearing simple work clothes, no trace of that infamous smirk. She checks her watch for the third time in 5 minutes. She doesn't have to be here. No court order, no mandatory check-in. Just her choice. That makes it harder somehow. Taking a deep breath, Maggie pushes through the heavy doors. The blast of air conditioning hits her face as she steps into the busy lobby. Officers mill about, some carrying coffee cups, others escorting people in and out. A few heads turn her way. They remember her. Of course they do. The front desk sits like a barrier between her and the rest of the station. Behind it, an older man with wire-rimmed glasses looks up from his computer. His eyes narrow slightly as recognition crosses his face. "Can I help you?" His tone is professional but guarded. Maggie uncrosses her arms, forcing herself to stand straight. "I need to see Officer Lawson." The receptionist's eyebrows lift slightly. He studies her for a moment, probably wondering if this is some kind of joke. Finally, he reaches for his phone. "Wait here," he says, punching in an extension number. Maggie nods and steps back, crossing her arms again. The lobby suddenly feels too small. She can feel eyes on her. Officers passing by, civilians waiting on benches. The clock on the wall ticks loudly in her ears. The door to the back of the station swings open with a metallic click. Officer Lawson steps out, his face carefully neutral. Maggie's stomach tightens. For the first time since deciding to come here, she feels genuinely nervous. Maggie sits stiffly in the hard plastic chair across from Lawson's desk, her fingers absently tracing the worn armrests. The office is smaller than she imagined, just a cramped space with filing cabinets, a computer, and a small window letting in strips of afternoon light. The walls are bare except for a framed badge and a few departmental certificates. Lawson watches her with that same unreadable expression he's worn since day one. His hands are folded on the desk, patient, waiting. The silence stretches between them like a rubber band about to snap. Maggie exhales sharply, suddenly feeling ridiculous. What was she thinking, coming here? The words she rehearsed on the drive over seemed to evaporate. Finally, Lawson breaks the heavy silence. You went through all this trouble to see me. Why? Maggie's throat feels dry. She swallows hard, then forces herself to meet his gaze. I never really said thank you. Lawson doesn't react at first, his expression unchanging. Then, after what feels like forever, he leans back in his chair, the leather creaking softly. You didn't have to, he says, his voice steady. But I'm glad you did. Maggie shifts uncomfortably in her seat. I don't expect you to forgive me. Lawson nods once, firmly. Good, because that's not what this is about. She frowns, caught off guard. Then what is it about? He studies her for a long moment, his dark eyes serious. About what you do next. The weight of his words fills the small office. Maggie feels them settle on her shoulders, not as a burden, but as a challenge. She stands up slowly, smoothing her pants. Just before she reaches the door, Lawson calls out, Take care of yourself, Maggie. She pauses, nods once, and walks away. Not because she's running, but because she's ready to move forward. The park bench creaks as Maggie settles into its weathered wood. Golden light spills across the city skyline, painting everything in warm hues. A couple jogs past, lost in conversation. A mother pushes a stroller, cooing at her baby. Two teenagers laugh over their phones on a nearby bench. Maggie takes a deep breath of the crisp evening air. For once, she doesn't feel like an outsider looking in. She's just another person, living her life, belonging to this moment. Her mind drifts back through the past 2 years. The red light she ran, the smirk in court, the ankle monitor. Lawson's stern presence. Dr. Carter's knowing eyes. Each memory used to feel like a wound, but now they're more like markers on a map, showing her how far she's come. She touches the bench's rough surface, feeling its grain under her fingertips. She can't erase what happened. The videos are still out there. People still sometimes whisper when they see her. But sitting here, watching the sky turn purple and orange, she realizes something. Maybe she doesn't need to erase it. Maybe those mistakes are part of who she is now, like rings in a tree trunk, showing growth. Her phone buzzes against her hip. When she pulls it out, Linda's name flashes on the screen. Tomorrow's schedule is up. You're on the early shift. A small smile tugs at her lips. No special treatment. No kid gloves. Just another shift at the diner, serving coffee and dealing with the morning rush. Normal life. Real life. She locks her phone, slips it back into her pocket, and stands. Her muscles stretch after sitting so long, but it feels good. Like waking up from a long sleep. Maggie walks forward, leaving the bench behind. She doesn't look back at it. Doesn't need to. The past is there, but it's not where she's going anymore. If you enjoyed the story of Marjorie, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.